Welcome to the Dialectic, a Fair Observer podcast by the Rajput and the Wasp. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. I'm the Rajput.
And I'm Glenn Carle, and I am the Wasp. In our last episode, we made sense, or tried to, of Vladimir Putin. In this episode, we analyze the implications of Putin's Russian invasion of Ukraine, the great event of our time.
So Glenn, what exactly is going on? You're a retired CIA officer. You have played hide and seek with the Russians during the Cold War. You're probably in the best position, the best place to educate someone like me as to what exactly is going on.
You're falsely modest, but becomingly so. It's hard to separate, really, what we talked about in our last episode with what is happening in Ukraine and what we'll try to speak about today. You can't really separate Putin's motivations and character, his worldview, from the events. They define everything. And those who have argued against the, quote, great man theory of history, that's, I think, have been shown to be grievously wrong. In most of my life, I would say, so we're talking several generations now, it's been really since the end of World War I and maybe World War II, so a long time, it's been fashionable or the conventional wisdom to deride the significance of great men. This rejection is due in part to the triumph in many ways of Marxist theory, and I'm not saying that to say that I agree with it, but it just has come to frame the perceptions and the debate of the intelligentsia. And this invasion in Ukraine, if anything should permanently debunk the theory that individuals don't matter fundamentally in history. The invasion would not have occurred were it not for Vladimir Putin. So what is going on? Well, the facts are, we all know the facts, that the Russian army has invaded Ukraine. The initial objectives of the Russian government are that it would, quote, denazify the Ukrainian government. Of course, there are no Nazis in the Ukrainian government. And as we all should know, ironically and rather outrageously, from if you swallow the Russian perspective, the president of Ukraine is a Jew. So it's an obscene allegation, but that's the ostensible reason for the invasion. The real reason is actually multiple. It's Ukraine in some ways is secondary. Vladimir Putin is seeking to recreate the Russian Empire, and also to push back, if not to undermine and destroy, the NATO alliance, which really is, in his view, a tool for American imperial hegemony. And all of which, the West, the United States, NATO, the loss of Central Europe, Russia's empire, Vladimir Putin views as literally existential threats. For him, the world is a zero-sum game. International relations is a zero-sum game. And unless Russia triumphs, it will fail. And so he feels compelled that it is his duty, as well as his destiny, to reabsorb Ukraine and undermine the West's power, which otherwise he views as an existential threat, particularly on the Russian border.
Well, Glenn, we wrote about this in our long article on Christmas Eve, on 24th of December last year, when we published our long article. We went into the roots of Russian resentment. We went into this extraordinary sense of loss, what Vladimir Putin called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, when millions of Russians, in his view, suddenly became foreigners in their own land. And we talked about how, in a way, the old pre-revolution Tsarist ideas have come storming back. This appeal to the Orthodox Church, this sense of Slavic nationalism, or Russian nationalism to be precise, this idea of being a great Eurasian power. And all of that drives Putin, as does the sense of revenge that people, people who went to your school, Harvard, and the great headline, remember, "The Harvard Boys Do Russia," was about Jeffrey Sachs and his ilk bringing shock therapy to Russia. Instead of the Marshall Plan, the Russians got shock therapy. And in a way, when we look back at this era, the 1990s may go down as America's Versailles moment, because shock therapy actually did give a huge economic shock, and it did provide Russia with another shock, Vladimir Putin. Had it not been for shock therapy, Putin would not be president. And had he not been president, we wouldn't be in the mess today. So, sometimes, as they say, the fluttering of the wings of a butterfly may cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. And this is not quite as far-fetched an analogy, but there are many variables that went into it. And what's going on right now is, in a way, Russia is attempting to retain its great power status. Russia is trying to check U.S. expansion as it sees it in its spheres of influence. Russia is reclaiming its historic kingdom of Rus, which lies in modern-day Ukraine, and so on and so forth. We discussed before this podcast that we'd go into why these things are happening, and one of the things you talked about was Russian realpolitik versus the Western normative liberal system. And as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant who created, or you didn't exactly create, but your forefathers created this system, what do you have to say about this?
Well, how we see the world will really, that becomes reality. I mean, reality is multiple. It depends on one's perspective.
You sound like Peter
ways.
Isaacson now.
I've been infected by postmodernist structuralism, I suppose. Well, probably the most prominent realpolitik person or disciple, believer, proselytizer is Professor Mearsheimer from Chicago.
He's brilliant.
He's very, very compelling in his arguments. For him, the concern about capitalism or communism, the liberal normative order, Russian pan-Slavism, all of these things are secondary to the reality of international relations, which is that it is a zero-sum game, that by definition, any power will seek one to survive, and to survive must seek to expand its influence. And that if its influence does not expand, then it is declining. Stasis doesn't really exist. There's an endless clash. It's a very Hobbesian view of the world. And therefore, it was an error by NATO to expand into what's now Central Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, because, goes the argument, of course, Russia would view this as an existential threat. It cannot be otherwise.
Well, that's not just his view, very much, Glenn, to be fair. That's George Kennan's view, and others take the same view as well.
Yes, yeah, true. Well, I too am largely a realist but of a slightly different strain. I'm a liberal realist, I think, which we'll possibly get to. But from this perspective, and it's very compelling, it explains much of history and more accurately than just about any other framework. of course, Russia would react. Now, from the Western normative liberal perspective, since individual rights and then extended to the level of a nation, the sovereignty of nations is a fundamental value, the deprivation of which is the definition of tyranny. It is desirable, if not obligatory, to try to promote, and at least to promote, to espouse, and possibly to defend that system. And that will set up an inevitable clash. There are two incompatible views of the world. Now, I think there's a solution to the incompatible philosophies, but it's a delicate one. That's why I said I was a liberal realist. We have seen for 80 years since World War II that it is possible to have an international system that is not zero sum, that doesn't threaten the existence of a state, and that does not oblige all states to compete by seeking the destruction of anyone who hinders the advance of a given nation's views. But to defend that, one has to act in a realpolitik way, which of course then makes it easy for the Russians, in this case, to claim that their adversaries, me or the Americans, are of course being hypocritical and speaking one way and acting another. But so you have overlapping, if not identical, clashes that have led to what's happening. You have the Russian realpolitik view, the irredentism of the Vladimir Putin, seeking to restore Russian greatness and influence. On one side, you have the normative system of liberal democracies and individual rights on the other, seeking to either protect or expand its system. So you have a combination of history and philosophy, and it's very important to mention the personal resentments and grievance. And here Vladimir Putin is, pardon me for using a very broad brush, pretty typically Russian. And the Russians combine defensiveness and a chip on their shoulder towards the West, an inferiority complex, and arrogance altogether, which makes it difficult to deal with them. One little anecdote, and then I'll stop. I thought when the Berlin Wall fell, naively, I thought, well, now that this system that has been imposed on so many has collapsed, surely my counterparts, a number of whom were my friends, Russian counterparts, will now seek to take rational decisions and embrace the Western norms. And I have found that for many, really for the apparatchiks, that has not been the case, and they're quite sincere in their views. They do view Western norms as decadent and a threat, and that's a legitimate position to have, I suppose. It's certainly not mine, but many of the influential individuals in the Russian governmental structure, in particular the intelligence services, do not embrace, and they vehemently reject and oppose the Western norms. Now, one last thing. It's true Jeffrey Sachs's policies led to catastrophe, but it's also true that for 30 years, I would argue, increasing percentage of Russian society has come to aspire to not just Western material goods, but the Western norms of behavior, which would be freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, individual rights, limitations on the power of the state. But they aren't the ones who control the guns or the intelligence services for the moment.
Well, what do you talk about Russian resentment and the curious conflicted Russian psyche, which is at the same time assertive and aggressive and confident but at the same time has a sense of an inferiority complex that could be used to describe any of the conquered societies. You could use it to describe the Chinese. They weren't exactly conquered, but they did suffer. You could use that to describe the Indians. You could use that even for many in the Middle East. So what is it that's so different about Russia? Is it that they have nuclear weapons? Is it that they have commodities? Is it that they have military experience and intelligence experience? Is it that they fell under the sway of communism and therefore developed global aspirations? So what makes Russia different?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. And your point about the resentment and wariness of the West, hostility towards the West, inferiority complex with combined with strong national pride, does well describe any post-colonial society. Now, Russia was never colonial, but Russia's had the misfortune, like Ukraine, even worse, of being, for significant parts geographically, on flat plains that are easy to invade, whether it be from the west, the north, or the east. And so that has made for a wary, suspicious culture, and understandably so, given the last 1,500 years of Russian-Ukrainian history. So I think that is a fundamental point that you make about the influence of colonization or external domination, perhaps is more appropriate in the Russian context. What would make Russia unique? I don't know that anything in particular does. I mean, they have their particularities of history and culture given their region, which makes the Ukraine issue a particularly sensitive one, impossible to dissociate from Russian history or European history. And I actually think that the influence, sort of surprisingly, coming from someone who grew up shaped by the Cold War as defining the world, that the influence of communism is quite secondary to Russia. I mean, you've pointed out, we both have in our talks and writings, that almost instantaneously with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the communist influences were largely relegated to the proverbial ash heap of history. And immediately Russian pan-Slavism, Russian pride in history and in the ethnic Russian culture and nation, and in the history of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great and so on, all immediately returned this mystical belief in the uniqueness of Russian culture, clearly as opposed to the decadent West or the looming dangerous East. So that's a particular Russian history, but every country has its own particular history, and otherwise I think they are resentful of the West for condescending to it.
Well, Russia is not any other country. Russia is the world's biggest exporter of natural gas, the second biggest exporter of oil, the third biggest exporter of coal. In fact, 50%, and this is something very few people know, 50% of the USA, or of the United States' uranium imports come from Russia. 25% of battery-grade nickel comes from Russia. About 10% of aluminium and copper comes from Russia. Palladium, which is a key component of automobiles and electronics, that comes from Russia. Now, I could go on, but there's one fact which is important. It's telling that the London Metal Exchange suspended nickel trading only for the second time in its 145-year history. And Russia is integrated into the modern globalized economy. Russia is a fundamental part of not just energy, but of supply chains and even of clean energy. If you want to drive cars, electric cars, which, Glenn, you do, you like electric cars, and then you need nickel, and that is immediately affected by all of this going on: the war, the sanctions, the freezing out of Russia from the financial system. In fact, let's say if none of that existed, even then you wouldn't be able to get things because of logistics. No one is insuring ships on the Black Sea. Maersk and MSC, the two great container companies, they are not operating. So we are in this curious phenomenon wherein energy prices are shooting up, food prices are shooting up, fertilizers are shooting up. We have inflation increasing. And so my question to you is, what are the consequences of this conflict? What happens now? We've had a bish bash bosh and we'll have a conflict, but what happens now to the world?
Right, which really is the larger question even. I wrote a piece not too long ago saying poor Ukraine for all of the horror and devastation that it has and will experience. It is in some ways secondary to the larger story, which is that this is truly a global event. And each day it continues, it becomes more so. So I think as you pointed out, I think we've touched upon the why this is happening, realpolitik versus the liberal system, frankly, paranoia by Russian elites and one man in particular, imperial irredentism, nostalgia for empire, the feeling of a need to establish buffer states and return Russia to greatness, and revenge against an imperious and condescending West. Okay, fine. But as you say, those things all lead to really the big questions. And I am becoming progressively alarmed at what the consequences will be. If I'll jump ahead of energy just for a moment and talk about food. You gave me the statistic in one of our conversations over the past several weeks that I think it's 80%.
I think 60 to 70, and in some countries even 80%.
Of the wheat grain imports in the Middle East, Egypt in particular, Lebanon and other states, comes directly from Ukraine and secondarily from Russia. Those two countries together account for, I think it's 25% of the world grain exports. I think India imports substantial amounts of grain from Russia and Ukraine. So what will happen?
I think India now is self-sufficient, Glenn. India used to. Okay. India has moved on. India, in fact, is a food surplus country, and India just sent 50,000 tons of wheat to Afghanistan, a fact very few people know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, good news amidst the bad news then. But this, as we've touched upon, I think in other talks, at least alluded to quickly, it's not simply a matter that food prices will go up. For me, sitting in a wealthy distant suburb of Boston, it's almost a so what. People can grouse over their cocktails that prices have gone up a bit. But in Egypt, it's a matter of the stability of the state. If the price of bread increases, then there are literally riots in the street because people are almost literally living on the edge of subsistence. There are very few buffers. And so what I think...
As someone once said, the frequency and probability, the possibility and probability of revolutions is directly proportional to the price of bread and maybe rice.
Yes, but somewhat amazingly, it's not a facetious or flippant comment. It's literally true. The way the Roman Empire maintained stability was through providing bread and circuses, entertainment.
And in China, it's rice. In Vietnam, it's rice. So it's bread and rice. Directly Absolutely. Proportional to the price of bread and or wheat.
Definitely.
Oh, sorry, wheat and or rice.
Yes, and so truly we may see the destabilization of states in the Middle East from this. I'm not predicting that Egypt will see another revolution, but the risk of that, of instability, is markedly increased in the Middle East in particular.
Yeah, particularly Lebanon.
If
Lebanon has only 1 month of supplies after that explosion. They can't store. Their storage facilities have gone down, and they are a multi-ethnic state with an
yeah,
economy that is already on its back. What happens now?
and, well, it's a horrifying prospect. Now, the Syrian civil war was caused, the proximate and probably the decisive cause, frankly, was the American invasion of Iraq, which I think destabilized the entire region. But the proximate cause, and perhaps uh, the cause without which Syria might have maintained its precarious stability, whatever one thinks of the Assad regime, was in this instance not food being not delivered from, not imported, but rather not being produced because of, frankly, of climate change and a severe drought, which devastated the agricultural sector, forced many people to, frankly, seek work and become de facto refugees in the cities of Syria, which overwhelmed the services capability of the state and destabilized the state. And then people started to go at each other's throats based on sectarian lines. Now, I'm not dismissing, I spent 20 years, 30 years of my life going after terrorists, and they were a factor also. But the fundamental factors were related to food, and in that instance, agriculture, failure. In this current instance, it's war, which is stopping the export from the granary of the world, which will be very destabilizing, absolutely destabilizing, and probably not just in the Middle East, but certainly there. Energy has a similar, and in some ways, simultaneously contradictory effects as energy prices, which means petroleum in its various forms. Prices go up. Of course, that will stress the entire global economy, the developed economies most, and the most energy intensive ones being the most developed ones the most directly. So that leads to inflation, which we're seeing not only because of the war, but the war is contributing to the rise of inflation in the world, and that will lead probably at some point to a recession, and because that will make interest rates go up, that will make it harder to purchase a home, to buy a car. Salaries will have to go up, and that will strain the developed economies. But at the same time, if energy prices come down significantly, then the energy producing states cannot make ends meet. So there is a very fine path to tread between the two extremes that we are going to be unable to tread for now. So the global economy is certainly going to take a hit. Now, all of these things, inflation doesn't affect production really for 6 to 18 months. It depends on the interest rates and so on. But certainly in the United States and everywhere, inflation has become a concern, which means it will have political consequences, which are not good for the incumbents, not good for the Democrats in the case of the United States. And if you have a recession come to the developed economies following on food-induced stresses on the less developed, less prosperous countries, then you have two elements leading to a true global crisis.
Yeah, and that is what a lot of economists and analysts have been writing about. In fact, there have been headlines like a toxic mix of recession, risks hangs over the world economy. There has been commentary about inflation, the energy crisis, even the Omicron outbreak in China. I mean, challenge is that it's a perfect storm. Energy, food, and fertilizers have all become interlinked because, as we know, fertilizers often come from natural gas, and Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia produce a lot of it. And so there's been already a huge amount of pressure on the global economy. Governments ran large deficits. Central banks ran loose monetary policy that added to inflationary pressures. This is what the economists in the US Treasury, and this is what bankers, central bankers, not investment bankers, although investment bankers also say this, but central bankers are more credible there, at least on a good day. And given those pressures, now a supply shock can really cause havoc, particularly for the poor countries who have a debt crisis, who already were grimly countenancing austerity in some ways. Greece already is facing problems. The inflation rates in Germany, for instance, have shot up. And we are facing this curious phenomenon wherein should inflation hit, should the world economy turn to recession, then it raises a bigger question. If that happens, will NATO stick together? Will people in various countries be willing to put up with the pain? Will the EU continue expanding? In Hungary, we've just seen Viktor Orban win, and win resoundingly. He's got a fourth term. And he's not exactly.
It helps when you rig. It helps when you rig the election, but he did win.
Well,
you won't find me saying too much positive about Viktor Orban.
That he may have or may not have, but the point is that Marine Le Pen is doing well in her opinion polls as well. So the big question becomes: is that should there be economic pain, will NATO keep expanding? Will the EU keep expanding? Glenn, shoot.
Yeah. Well, I think you touch upon. I mean, these are fundamental issues, but the why behind Viktor Orban or Marine Le Pen's significance is an issue I think we've touched upon in other fora, but it's certainly worth talking about. Only to mention here, because today we're talking about the Russian invasion. But that's an even deeper issue of society's reactions to the consequences of globalization and modernization, really. Orban and all of his similar like-minded people on the right, and I would include Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Marine Le Pen, and other populists, nationalists, fascists, and conservatives, social conservatives, react to fear the other in direct proportion to the increasing pace of change and the loss of traditional hierarchies and so on. So that's a deep, important issue, but not one that I can directly attribute to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
But it exacerbates these trends. That's the point I'm making, is when you have economic hardship, when you had the collapse in Germany, when you had hyperinflation in the 1920s, that paved the way for the Nazi Party. And my point is not that these are new trends. These are long-standing trends. I've written about them for a while, almost a decade. But the point is that now they may be exacerbated. And it may also lead to pressures of what many analysts, many commentators, journalists, economists, etc. are calling globalisation. They're saying, we'll see a shortening of supply chains, because actually, if you have supply chains that are very intricate, that are inextricably interlinked, you can have a war and suddenly you can't get cars, or suddenly you can't get masks, as we discovered during COVID. So there'll be shortening of supply chains, there'll be reshoring. People are talking about the end of the peace dividend. One of the military attaches said that when you have peace for a long time, you get peace dementia, and Europe ended up having peace dementia. And now Europe will have to increase its spending, which means that taxes will go up, which means Europe will have, at the same time, perhaps a bigger state and a smaller state. What he meant by that was that there will be pressure on the welfare state. So maybe there'll be less visits to the doctor, less visits to the dentist, but more jets, more missiles. So the point I was making is that what does this trigger? Internally, externally, does it mean now that there's a Russia-China axis, or does it mean now, so far at least, the state-backed petroleum companies are not buying Russian oil? Or does that mean that the China and the US have some sort of quiet rapprochement? Because China sees the price of underestimating the West and the financial costs of doing so. Or does it mean the dollar is weakened because the West has used its nuclear option when it comes to financial instruments, SWIFT, banning Russia from SWIFT or seizing central bank reserves, and we are going to see a move towards a petro-yuan. So, the possibilities are galore. We don't have time until tomorrow to discuss this, but I'd love to hear, what flows on from here, Glenn.
Yeah, it does seem a turning point. What's the expression that the Chancellor Scholz used? It's I'm forgetting my German. It's a bend in the road is how it translates, but it sounds better in German. It's more decisive. It's a more decisive implication than the expression I just used. I think that this is correct, and I think in many ways, however Ukraine the war ends, strategically Putin has made a catastrophic mistake from his perspective, because he has, I think, weakened his geopolitical position. But it's also fractured at least the what one imagined was the international system, or the direction of the international system, and it is now again closer to a bipolar, divided Cold War world, where the norms, whether there's increasing free trade or retrenchment, is secondary. That will be on one side a globalized economy, and on the other a opposing sort of national top-down system. China's the big question. It has played. I think it's gotten off the hook more than it actually should by presenting itself formally as not party to the dispute and hoping for peace and not taking sides, when in fact its intelligence services and its propaganda mechanisms have been pretty strongly hostile to the West, to the United States, in all of this. However, as you pointed out, China is different from Russia in that it doesn't reject the international order that it can't measure up to, but that it profits from and is progressively being more influential in, if not coming to be the first among equals in various domains. So it's an open question how, as we go forward, China will respond to this. I don't see them killing the goose that lays the golden eggs of international integration and trade, or certainly they don't want to. And I think they have been given pause, seeing how hard it is to invade and subsume a country. With respect to Taiwan, I've long thought that China can achieve most of what it seeks by just continuing to do what it's done for the last 30 years. But the rise in Xi Jinping's nationalist perspective places that somewhat in doubt. I think perhaps they might rethink that, but I'm always wary of projecting what I think is a rational perspective onto a foreign leader. But I think we'll see a continued, for a long period of time now, this more divided world that is not as clearly moving towards global integration. But then, if Putin disappears, there are large numbers of the Russian elite and the population who are appalled at what's happened and aspire fundamentally to being a state like Ukraine hoped to be.
Well, that may happen, but going back to what you were talking about, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, and he was addressing the Bundestag on 24th of February, and he called Zeitenwende, which obviously sounds wonderful.
There it is.
It means turning from.
Your German is better than mine.
No, it isn't. It's it's just the privilege of living with Germans for 2 years or a year and a bit in the same house. It means turning from one epoch to another. I hope I've got that right. It could be, as you said, going back to the Cold War, or it could be going back to the pre-World War One tripolar, bipolar spheres, because what we are seeing very interestingly is that whilst Europe is very united over Ukraine, a lot of people are positing in the former colonies that, look, there's a war on in Tigray, there's a Tigray war in Ethiopia, 500,000 have died, and there's no coverage. So this war matters only because it's white people in Ukraine. Right. And that's a persistent and recurring theme all across Africa, all across Asia, which is where I come from. In fact, a video went viral by a rather, populist channel, which went on about the racism in coverage. And that is something that may just be passing, but maybe there's something more there. Maybe we are headed to a tripolar, bipolar world. Maybe globalization ends. Maybe it is going to be more autarkic, more national security concerns dominated economies going forward. It's certainly a Zeitenwende. I think this ends what some people are saying the post-Cold War era.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you made two big points. The easier one first, the concern of what used to be called the Third World, post-colonial states, modernizing states, less developed, poorer, all of the above states, the resentment about the attention being paid to the war in Ukraine as opposed to what's happening in Eritrea or the Congo or Sudan, or you choose the point where horrible things have happened.
Afghanistan, which people are very cross in India that it is forgotten. In India, that has led to cold fury.
It's all understandable. If you're Afghan and you have someone killed, that is as devastating as when a Ukrainian dies or anyone.
Exactly.
But I actually think that it's self-referential and therefore distorting. It's simply a fact that the million dead or more in the fighting in Congo or in Rwanda, where I used to work, or you choose the terrible place, are less consequential globally, have been in most instances than this current crisis. And it's not only because, it isn't because the Ukrainians look like me as a West European, and therefore there's a racist component. Certainly they're closer. One identifies more if one is from Western Europe with someone from Ukraine than someone from Congo. That isn't proof of racism, that's natural, but that's not the fundamental difference. The fundamental difference in why the United States and NATO are paying more attention is that it is both a potentially existential issue for the Western civilizations or nations, one, and two, it is globally more consequential already. We spent a half hour or whatever it is discussing some of the unavoidable global effects. The million dead in the Congo, each of them a horrible loss, have not do not affect the globe in the same way, and that's not meant to be cruel. That simply is the case. So I find that the anger is understandable if you're an Indian with regard to what's happened in Afghanistan and the attention paid to it or lack thereof compared to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Understandable, but I think that it is actually not taking, in a global sense, measuring the impact and the consequences in an accurate way. On the tripolar point, there I'm more pessimistic than you, I think. Maybe, I don't know if pessimistic is the word. I don't know that it's a bipolar or tripolar system, and one of the ironies of
it could be many more. It could be many powers dominating their near neighborhoods.
Absolutely, yeah. This is one of the ironies of the Pax Americana, is that the success of America's mission to create this integrated world of democracies and capitalist economies leads to the relative loss of hegemony by the United States. The United States can no longer controls literally more than 50% of the global GNP, which was the case in 1945. Yeah. Today it's 22%. India is becoming, if not already, a global power.
China is a global power.
Is a glal power. The European Union on economic issues is a global power.
It's bigger than the US economically. By some measures.
Turkey is at least a regional power. So the old bipolar or tripolar world is gone. It's in that sense, I agree with you. It's more like pre-1914. And it's the hardest condition, status in nature to maintain is an equilibrium. And as you have more factors in the equation becomes harder to resolve. And so we're in for unpredictable variations as the world is multipolar.
So a roller coaster rough ride. Now, we've not had time to go into how warfare might change. We've seen tanks. We've seen tanks have been gutted. Missiles, anti-tank missiles, and drones have done a good job. We haven't had time to talk about piloted fighter jets and capital ships with thousands aboard. We could have talked about many things, but I think in the interests of time, what our listeners might be very curious about, and what I am very curious about, is what next? Can we expect this conflict to end anytime soon? Because maybe Russia is reaching, I think it was Clausewitz, wasn't it, who said it's reaching its culminating point. Do we expect a ceasefire? Will there be a partition? Will NATO jump in? What does China do? What does Turkey do? After all, both of them will have roles too. So over to you, Glenn. Educate us.
Oh, thanks. There's an easy question to address.
Exactly. Make sense of the world for us. That's our motto, Glenn. Make sense of the world. No less will do. No less will do.
Okay. Well, if I were delusional, or at least more delusional than I'm aware of, then I wouldn't hesitate as much to it. Doubt is a sign of wisdom, even if it is nothing but the expression of ignorance.
So they say.
I must be very wise then, since I know nothing. I write for a magazine in Japan, and my editors asked me in December to write to predict the events of the coming year, which is a standard article that magazines will put out. And I tried to beg off because a lesson you learn as an intelligence officer in intelligence services that our crystal balls are non-functional. We have no predictive powers, particularly. It is very difficult to see a solution that will be acceptable to the Ukraine war to both sides. At this point, I have trouble imagining the Ukrainians really accepting the loss of Donbass and Luhansk, or for that matter, acknowledging the loss of Crimea. And I find it equally hard to imagine Vladimir Putin accepting that to withdraw all his troops, having lost half of his army, and just said, well, it was a nice vacation, across the border, and now we're going home. I don't think that's going to happen. So I don't see an easy way out. The only conceivable way, you and I spoke before the invasion of a number of ways that we thought could have been ways for both sides to declare victory and avoid a catastrophe. I guess the only imaginable thing that I can see is that the geographical control by Russia and Ukraine, respectively, returns to the status quo ante, to where things were before the invasion, which means that Russia's controlling parts of eastern Ukraine and the Crimea, and the rest is unchanged. And that would just give a hideous lie or futility to the loss of half of Russia's army and personnel and the destruction of large parts of Ukraine. It certainly guarantees whatever the solution, so long as Ukraine remains an independent state, which appears to be certain to be the case. The dramatically increased, accelerated westernization integration of Ukraine to the West. Now, you can formally join the EU or formally join NATO or not, but the formal aspect is almost secondary to the fundamental cultural, economic integration that will accelerate even beyond what was the case between 2014 and 2022. China has a chance to play a constructive role, but I frankly think that it's blowing it by aligning itself pretty clearly with Russia while trying to stay out of everyone's sights, and so I don't think that they are shaping up to be a decisive influence here.
It's the 100th year of the CCP, isn't it? Of the Chinese Communist Party. They're celebrating it this year.
Yes, that's right. And more importantly, it's the declaration of Xi Jinping as emperor for life.
Yes, of course. So they're doing gloriously. They have a glorious present to handle this year. They've got the Ukraine conflict, inflation, Omicron.
Omicron, yeah.
So and of course, not to forget their own increasing defense cooperation with Russia, all of which doesn't seem to bode very well for their future. It doesn't seem that the CCP's future is terribly bright, or Xi Jinping will be immortal.
It's a bit of a. I'm a little surprised. Well, forget a little. I am surprised that you think, okay, from China's perspective, allying with Russia as the anti-Western hegemony option makes sense, and we all have thought, and certainly I have about the great power of the Russian military, and it is large, and probably was the second or third most powerful in the world. But I would hope that the Chinese leadership, which means Xi Jinping, would put onto the scale of judgment, okay, the benefits of aligning myself with the Russian military and society, as opposed to the benefits of finding a modus vivendi that's better with the Western economies. And I find it hard to see how they could conclude that aligning with Russia is more beneficial. But so far, that's what they've done.
Well, we'll see what happens, because the West itself, particularly Europe and NATO, are going to see tensions as economic pressure mounts. Turkey, of course, is playing its own hand, and it is apparently, I hear, the back channel for talks with Russia from time to time. you'd know much more about it than me, and there certainly seems to be a very shifting chessboard. In fact, the rules of the game are changing, not just the chess pieces themselves. And there was a Chinese philosopher who said, "May you live in interesting times." And boy, oh boy, we certainly do. These are the most interesting of times, indeed.
I think I'd like to ask a last question, which maybe opens another important perspective we haven't touched upon, I think, enough. And that is, speak about the approach that India is taking, not just because India is a significant global power, but as representative perhaps of the dilemmas of countries that are, or the options, the aspirations of countries that are not clearly in the Western alliance or clearly a part of the Russian Chinese imperium.
Well, India is caught between two worlds. Obviously, investment in India comes from the US. Apparently, Blackstone alone has put $100 billion in India. India exports a lot to the US. India supplies the US with the chief executive officers. India is increasingly seen as a democracy and a counterweight to China. There is the Quad, and there's a 2+2 summit very shortly. So India is very much deepening its relationships with the US and indeed the so-called West. But at the same time, India gets its energy from the Middle East. India did not like the fact that it was told it couldn't get any oil from Iran. It lost leverage vis-a-vis Middle East oil producers. India gets its defense equipment largely from Russia, so it needs spares, it needs hardware. S-400s are much cheaper than anything you can get from Europe or the US. And most importantly, India gets technology transfer from Russia, which the US in particular, and even the Europeans, with the exception of France, and even France has not been the same as Russia, have been more reluctant about. So India wants to keep its economic, geopolitical, and military ambitions intact, and it doesn't want to jump on any side. And for that matter, India is trying to take the most pragmatic of stands. India does not want Russia to completely side with China in the case of a conflict. It has two nuclear-armed neighbors. India is extremely nervous about a two-front war. Should Russia decisively back China, India would be finished. India just cannot act with the impunity that many other countries can. And I think this is precisely the point, is that with the US no longer having 50% of the GNP, countries are no longer willing to say, this is a breach of the international order, and we'll just side with the US because of a normative issue. They look at the US with far more suspicion because of its recent record in Iraq, not to mention things earlier, but also because what can you give us? You have a huge deficit. You can't do the equivalent of a Marshall Plan. So we have to watch out for ourselves. And I think that is where the crux lies. And therefore, we are going to see around the world countries acting more and more in terms of their national interest. And we are going back, as you said, to the pre-World War I era. Many spheres of influence, many a roller coaster ahead.
It's less than a time of opportunity than it is a time of anxiety and increasing risks for miscalculation.
Well, maybe it is a time for opportunity, because think of it this way. For a long time, the US has deindustrialized and all the factories have gone away. And maybe with globalization, maybe with reshoring, maybe you'll get the factory flow back, because ultimately innovation doesn't really happen within a university. Let's be honest. The first act the United States Congress passed was a protectionist act. And all the countries that industrialized, including the UK, had some form of protectionism. Now, protectionism backfired spectacularly when socialist India tried it. So it is a very, very, very blunt tool. But really, when people start working with their hands in the factory floor, when they start following what Max Weber called the Protestant work ethic, and they believe in what Martin Luther called work is worship, then they start making things. And out of that, perhaps a more dynamic economy, more innovation, new materials, new ways of manufacturing stuff, a combination of hardware and software. Maybe this is the bump which the US and the so-called decadent West needed to shake itself out of its stupor. Maybe this is a great time for innovation, because yes, World War I was terrible, but after World War I came votes for women. Yes, World War II was horrific, but after that came the welfare states of Europe. So I'd like to end on a positive note. I'd like to hope that this is a moment for innovation and a small setback before humanity rebounds and marches on to the great sunlit uplands.
Well, yes. Well, for us to end on a positive note, I will have to remain silent then, I think.
Oh dear. Surely you believe in what Churchill said 7.5 decades ago, or more actually, 8 decades ago perhaps.
Well, I admire Churchill. I'm hopeful. I hope that he's speaking the truth, but I also know that no man is a hero to his valet. And the more one knows, the grainier reality becomes. So I'm hopeful, but not an optimist.
So on that grainy note, thank you for listening to us. This is, of course, The Dialectic by the Rajput and the Wasp. This is Atul Singh and, of course, Glenn Carle. We look forward to having you listen to this episode, to the next episode, to write to us, to suggest what you'd like us to talk about, to make sense about, and I'll let Glenn have the last word.
Send all criticisms to Atul. I welcome the praise. No, I'm being silly. Of course, comments are welcome. I never found too much benefit in those notes that people write on the bottom of blog comments and so on online, but thoughtful comments are indispensable.
Okay, until next time. Bye for now.
Goodbye.